Okay, so I think quite a lot of people are here now, so I'm going to start off with a little introduction of SIA, the Structural Inequality Alliance. My name is Caroline, and I am the newly appointed network manager for the Alliance. The Structural Inequality Alliance is a collaborative network, I guess, a collection of leaders from different sectors who are curious and excited about dismantling structural inequality. We want to work beyond our sectors and our spheres and our knowledge and expertise with others, so crossing the silos to dismantle structural inequality. And when I talk about structural inequality, what I mean is the design fault in our systems and our institutions, which means that some of us thrive in health, wealth, and power, whilst others of us are ignored, forgotten, and marginalised. So imagine life as a journey. We're all on that journey, and we're just doing the best that we can. And there are plenty of obstacles and assistance along the way. And those big institutions that I'm talking about, those institutions and systems who are helping us, view them as escalators, let's say. Some of us are only finding up escalators along the way, and we're just getting on as we should be, and that's all really good and well. But some of us are running as fast as we can up the down escalator, and that really matters because it's exhausting, and it's so exhausting that some of us are dying 10 years earlier than our friends who are just going up the escalators. And really, that's not okay. But it is there by design, and that means that we can design it out. And one of the solutions that we think about is that you can change who is involved in the conversation, who's making the rules, and who's having a say and an input into the policies that make our systems and institutions work. So today we've curated a wonderful panel discussion with some great speakers to share their expertise and experience and knowledge and understanding of how we widen, I guess, the table, make room at the table so that more of us can be involved in making decisions and influencing the things that matter and that have an impact on us. And most particularly, the people who are at the sharp edge of the table, the sharp end of it, who are most negatively impacted by what is supposed to be helping us and assisting us get on through our journey of life. I think I'm mixing my metaphors up now, so that's probably enough from me. So we've got some great speakers. They are going to speak for 10 minutes each, and then we will open to a Q&A. Which I will moderate, and we will do that. So do put your questions in the chat throughout. I think that's it. Am I forgetting anything, anyone? No, I'm not seeing anything. I think we're doing okay. Okay, so I'm going to let the speakers introduce themselves because I think they can do a much better job than I can. So to start us off, welcome, Darren. Oh, bless you. Sorry, our third speaker has had a mad dash across London, so we're really lucky that he's been able to join us despite the public transport. There's a system that we could discuss, but maybe we won't today. So anyway, I digress. I'm going to introduce you to Katy Rubin and John Organ. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So the two of you, you've got 10 minutes now. I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is Katy Rubin. I am a legislative theatre practitioner based here in Manchester. That's where we are.
I'm John, and I really like metaphors too, particularly the one about the escalator being powered by the people mashed into the bottom of it going backwards. So that was a great one.
And we work together as one of the places where we do some legislative theater and co-producing policies called the GM Jokers. But we and we've been working together since a big project that we'll talk about in a few minutes here in Greater Manchester, co-producing the 5-year GM homelessness prevention strategy. So I think we've known each other since the beginning of 2020.
Yeah.
If not before. Oh, right, actually before. So we're going to talk about, this idea of legislative theater as one of these potential models, and then some of the lessons that it might shed for us. So where do we want to start?
Do you want to do a slideshow for the lovely people at home / Costa?
Awesome. Let's tell you really briefly what legislative theater is, because maybe it's the first time you've heard of it. So we're going to share a few images and just really briefly the process. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we're going to play this little slideshow. So I think everybody can see that. And sometimes we call this process watch, act, vote. So you can see on the slides. And what do we mean by that? So first, communities who are impacted by local or national or regional policy or practice gather to tell stories, play games, and through those stories and games, find connections and build a play about shared experiences, particularly shared experiences of barriers in those policies or practices. And then they develop a short play that illustrates the human impact, that's really important, of inequitable or out of date or ineffective policies or practices. So here, for example, you see young people working on youth mental health services in Greater Manchester. And this process could include address all kinds of policy issues from housing, climate justice, urban planning, economic development, immigration. We understand that all those issues also intersect. So we just came from a little mini process on immigration policy and the 10-year route to citizenship for asylum seekers, for example. And then those plays move to a public legislative theater or participatory democracy session, which brings together local and national government, sometimes community organizations, always advocates, lawyers or other experts, and residents who are also directly impacted by the problem, who are active participants, or we sometimes say spectators, right? Everyone is a spectator, a spectator, someone who watches, but also an actor, someone who takes action. And we say that everyone is also a policymaker, someone who can make policy. So after a critical analysis of the issue and the problems in the play, we actually invite those spectators to try out new policy and practice ideas on stage, testing them, improvising them, revealing further opportunities, ways to develop their ideas further, or new barriers with their ideas. And that leads audience members and everyone involved to actually draft their own policies and then sort them with policymakers, advocates, experts who are there in the room to come together around 3 or 4 policy priorities, or maybe more, depending on the process, what's new, what's popular, what's practical, aiming towards transparency, which we're going to keep talking about, and accountability. Those are really some big questions for us today. And the top proposals are brought to the audience for debate and amendments, further discussion, deliberation, and a vote as a joyous and collective action, leading to decision makers committing to measurable and time-bound follow-up actions within their areas of influence, right? So this is not the end. Policymaking and co-production is a long journey in which actors continue to advocate for the proposals and celebrate wins together. And here you see, I think, me and John and lots of our colleagues and some other international folks, where the Greater Manchester Homelessness Prevention Strategy Legislative Theater process from 2020 to 2021 won the International Observatory on Participatory Democracy's Best Practice in Citizen Participation Award. And we were there in Grenoble in the mountains last December. So that's the process in a nutshell. We also really prioritize embedding facilitation training and ongoing leadership into that process. And this process is also happening internationally, as you see recently here in Colombia, around water access and thinking about rebuilding trust. So that's the process. And I think, you know, as we, I hope you followed along okay here. So John, we talked particularly about this Greater Manchester Homelessness Prevention Strategy that we work together on, and we still think about it a lot. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and sort of what were some of the wins from that process?
I think a win is getting getting access to a table of some kind. So it's like access and relationship building with people who do policy. That'd be like a really small, basic one. I think what I'm definitely always looking for is anything that raises a situation where we've got people who have never and are never likely to experience a problem making a policy. Like in any other sphere, that would be absolutely nuts. You're not going to get like someone from Sainsbury's to Burger King who had no interest in either A, exploitive supermarkets, or B, what beef tastes like. But we think it's fine for this. And this is why we're still talking about seldom heard voices. And so I think one of the successes is challenging that assumption. It gives the organisation in Greater Manchester a clear route into directly resourcing the people affected and a clear position of where to rearrange power if they actually want to change it. Now, the actually want to change it bit might be the conflict you were talking about.
Yeah.
Is it, Katy?
Yeah. So absolutely. I mean, we've been thinking a lot about conflict today, and legislative theater sort of begins with an idea of a conflict or a barrier, right? In a sense, and we'll think about that more in a second. And I like how you were saying kind of this process is formally recognized and resourced, right? It's paid for, and everyone who's involved in any of these processes gets paid, and that's really key. But and some of the things that came out of that process, for example, right, 23 proposals were integrated into the strategy. There's been new hires. Some of those hires are at management level in the GMCA, people with lived experience actually taking on those roles. But something that you've brought up is, are those roles, are those roles still truly valued in terms of informing future policymaking? And so let's think about, those were some of the wins, but you're starting to hint at what were some of the challenges or barriers or failures of this kind of work.
Yeah, well, I think it goes to how you introduced this, because the prevention strategy was built during lockdown, wasn't it? And then we had like a full suite of available policy levers directed at homelessness. So you had immediately accessible hotel accommodation available. You had a suspension on evictions. You had United and communicative services really freed up to work collaboratively on site. You had an end to the kind of boundary working because you had a broader public health issue. And so, wow, that's fucking amazing. That's a huge impact you've had on homelessness. So if you really want to prevent homelessness, how many of those do you think you might keep using? Well, if you're kind of new to this world, you go, well, maybe all of them. Would the answer be none of them? Let's do the exact opposite.
Yeah.
As quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And I think I'm saying gives you the platform to play with that absurdity a little bit, rather than just throw your hands in the air and go, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. You've got a minute and a half left.
Okay, great. So I think one of the things we're thinking about here, and if we think about how to move this towards other policymaking spaces, national policymaking spaces where the stakes even get higher and it feels more scary for policymakers to involve lots of people in this kind of particularly risky and hands-on way, right? What you're saying, John, is that we know what the solutions are. In this example, the homelessness. In fact, a lot of them were implemented already during COVID, right? We know what the solutions are to a housing crisis. We know what the solutions are to the failing NHS, for example. And then what you were saying earlier when we were chatting, which I loved, is that the solution and the right answer are not always the same in a policymaking conversation. And so one of the opportunities of bringing this to the stage is opening up a space for sort of radical transparency. Right? Either it needs to be winnable, and so we need to actually arrive at the solutions and have that willingness from the decision makers to implement them. Or if they're not going to look for those solutions, if they're not going to go for those solutions and they're going to look for the right answer, which is probably going to perpetuate inequality, then we're trying to say, what is the opportunity for this participatory democracy is radical transparency about why what are the hidden interests and the hidden bureaucracies around this problem. And that's the opportunity too of really a really, really kind of deep co-production is to open up that radical transparency. And then to your point about conflict, right? I think this is something that we want to put to the other speakers in the audience, is that co-production does not mean that we're all on the same page, right? It doesn't mean that everybody wants the same thing. It might mean that we need to actually really open up our understanding of the conflict between different interests and make that really visible and sit with it. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's just a useful reframing for this conversation here. It's like you're creating a civic space for a structural problem, where what we've got generally is just partisan interests screaming at each other without little traction to actually get involved in the minutiae.
Absolutely.
That seems like a good place to stop. I'm so sorry to cut you off.
No, that's it.
Feel good about that. I love that. I've got lots of reflections, but I won't take up anyone's time. So I'm sure they'll come out in the Q&A. Thank you so much for opening our event in such a great, clear and fun, joyful way. I'm going to hand over to Isaac Samuels, who's here representing Not Another co-production project. Over to you, Isaac. I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Oh, thanks very much. So I'm not really sure how I follow on from that, but what I would probably start with is the idea of seldom heard communities. So when I started my own journey over 20-something years ago in mental health services, it was very clear that Black men were very present in those spaces and were having very different experiences. Now, fast forward to yesterday, the day before, those still the same people are in those spaces having the same experiences. What has happened where we haven't moved on so far? So we talk about co-production, and I'm someone that is involved in lots of co-production, but the very tool that we're using often is the very barrier. So very Western concept of doing two people, not recognizing that communities, diverse communities have been doing what we would probably say is co-production in a really Western concept for thousands of years, how we really draw on the experiences. And we do a lot of storytelling, and the work that we do is really important because what we try to do is we try to turn down the outside loud voices and amplify those voices that might be easy to ignore or struggle to find a place, particularly within a policy context. I think it's fair to say that most policy context work that we do is very tokenistic and would pay attention to the voices that resonate with the policymakers' experiences. And we often go into the space of not really thinking about our own colonized thinking, our own biases, the processes and structures that are surrounding the way that we deliver and think about public services. And one of the ways that us as an organization have really tried to change that status quo is really thinking about power. And that's probably a bit of a challenge within that policy context, and it is a challenge all the time, how we disrupt that status quo. And sorry, I'm probably using a lot of jargon, how we try to disrupt that thinking and that reality for people that might struggle to have a voice is sharing stories. And we use a process called community reporting, where there are lots of peer-to-peer conversations about particular topics or particular opportunities or challenges that affect particular communities. And those peer-to-peer conversations are recorded. I'd like to share, if it's okay, one of the conversations that we recorded as a team around ensuring that the voice of deaf and disabled people and carers were heard within the policy context of the COVID inquiry. Hopefully this will all work. And I'm just wanted to give people a bit of a content warning. So this is a very emotive topic, and this may resonate with some of your own experiences. But this is a really important piece of work and an approach that we take. So we capture these lived experience stories in a peer-to-peer conversation. We use those stories with change makers, policy makers, to really think about what needs to change. Hopefully this will play. Oops. Is it not playing? Oh. Are you not going to play for me? Maybe I'll come back to it. Sorry, I'm having a bit of tech issue, but the reason why we use stories is we really want to bring that lived experience into the kind of conversations, and these stories that we use are fundamentally the reason why we want to create that change. And it can be really, really difficult. So often organizations work with communities in a way that is very transactional, and we try to work in a way that is very much about creating the right conditions. It doesn't necessarily fit into those really kind of project comfortable timelines. And we have a long-term kind of approach to working alongside people in a way that sees people as, authors of their own stories. We believe that stories are really, really important. And the stories have to be the reason for change. So it's not us predetermining what we would like to see change in kind of a policy context, but actually what people and communities need to see. And we use a cycle called a community reporting cycle, and there are 3 distinct stages to our cycle. One is that we capture stories of lived experiences in a peer-to-peer way, and then we invite those very individuals that have shared their stories to help us come and make sense of what stories they would like to privilege, what stories they'd like to share, and how we can then organize those stories for greater social change. The story work is really time consuming, and often the thing that isn't necessarily welcomed by policymakers, but absolutely within our work, it has changed the way that policies are delivered, how policies are co-designed. And I use like lots of buzzwords, co-design, co-delivered, and all that kind of stuff, because actually what's really important is the very people that will be benefiting from any policy have to be central to that kind of policy development. We as an organization have very much taken the approach to work in a really kind of bottom-up way, trying to minimize some of the power that we have. So we really think about how do we create the right conditions for people to be involved? How do we ensure that everybody's having an equitable experience? And that's really challenging, particularly in a policy context world, because lots of people see equality is the most important thing, but actually how do we actively minimize the barriers for people from easy to ignore groups? How do we as a community that is really valuing co-production move beyond the current thinking and knowledge that we have? How do we learn? And how do we exchange knowledge in a way that makes sense to individuals in the real world, and translate that into a policy context? Often there's like a really big reality rhetoric gap. So people will tell us about their experiences, and we will then want to share those experiences with policymakers, people to be alongside those, alongside us sharing those. And it's just lost in translation a lot of the time. So how do we get those policymakers and people with power to really understand what's important to people, communities, and how do we get that policy to make sense? I think we're on a journey. I think that our journey is quite messy, and we have to embrace that messiness. Often organizations shy away from like that really kind of messy, emergent.
2 minutes left. Sorry, Isaac.
Thank you. That really messy emergent approach. We believe in some principles around no fixing. So we don't try to fix people. What we try to do is be alongside people. Having fun is really important. So policy work can be really, really fun, and it makes things less scary. Most people don't really want to be in co-production or in policy world. They want to have good lives. It's okay, you know, to disagree, but let's do that respectfully. How do we contract and share our values and opinions, that particularly when they're coming from different places? We bring people that are from different communities and different perspectives together. And certainly one of our most important principles is it's okay to be a bit rubbish sometimes. It's okay to fail, and we'll try again. And really what we try to foster within the work that we do is, when you see somebody struggling, how do you really get them to help you? So actually not thinking about people as passive recipients of health and social care, but actually people with lots of knowledge and talent and skill, and how they can come and teach us and share their knowledge, so we can then help policymakers really make policies that make a difference. We're certainly going into that more creative space of like using stories. Unfortunately, my tech has failed miserably. I will share it as a link in the chat if that's okay. But what we do in all of our work is get people to connect with the feelings and emotions, because we can talk about experiences, but unless we connect individually with those feelings and emotions, then we can't really do the work justice. I'm going to share that link, and sorry for the tech issues. I'll share the principles and the link, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thanks, Isaac. Yes, of course. Sorry about that. It's disconcerting when you're trying to talk and sort out your bids. I love that. Thanks. There's lots of common themes. Again, I've got lots of ideas and things I want to say, but I'm going to be really good and just hand over to Darren Sharpe, who I'm going to let introduce himself. Darren, I'll give you a 2-minute warning.
Okay, fabulous. Nice to meet you, Caroline, and everybody else. My apologies to begin with for running slightly late, not joining you earlier. So my name's Dr. Darren Sharpe, and I am a policy fellow based at the University College London. And so I'm going to just be really sharing my story, my experiences of a project I've been working on recently with Newham Council. The project is a participatory policymaking project. And the ultimate outcome is about engaging marginalised sections of the community in Newham in order to involve them in policy making at the level of changing services and how practice is being delivered, all the way up to more kind of corporate strategy. So my apologies, inherently, my presentation is going to be far more dull than the previous two speakers, by definition of me being an academic. But nonetheless, it's been a really interesting piece of work I've been doing for the last year. Just as a definition point, and speaking to structural inequalities, and leaning back actually into the last speaker, I would say my work has been tokenistic. It's only been scratching at the surface. Nonetheless, it's been a very important piece of work. And just getting like the elephant out of the room in terms of structural inequalities, it's a term we all throw around as part of all our rights, but what does it actually mean? And why would I say my work is just really scratching at the surface? A good example of this for me, in making it more tangible, is the notion of kind of property ownership in the UK. As a classic example, in terms of if you acquire a lease, you never actually own the land. So you can get a mortgage, you can buy a property, you can get the lease, and it may last from 1 year to 1,000 years, but ultimately you don't own the freehold. The freehold goes all the way back to feudal society, where you've got a minority of individuals what own a vast amount of land in the UK, and is wired into the societal DNA. And they retain that wealth, the land returns back to them. So when we're talking about structural inequalities, it's both deep-rooted, you can say, accordats or norms, what really forms this structure of inequality. My project, again, is around the edges, it's tinkering at the edges, and it doesn't get to those key points. But what it is about kind of mobilizing and empowering residents who may normally feel disempowered or voiceless or not heard to get involved. So the fellowship I'm working under is called the CAPE Fellowship, and CAPE stands for Capabilities in Academic Policy Exchange. And so this is a government initiative where they sponsor kind of knowledge transfer. In my case, I'm an academic, what was embedded in the policy and strategy team in Newham Council, but you also have policy officers in the public sector going into academic spaces. So it's all about nurturing relationships and nurturing conversations around specific issues at all levels of government. So I've got colleagues who are in Parliament, who were kind of at the Welsh Assembly, etc., and vice versa. So it's a government initiative to fund and stimulate these ideas. Newham identified, and for people who aren't familiar with Newham was where the 2012 Olympics took place. It's known internationally for regeneration, or the success story deriving from regeneration. It also served as a migrant gateway throughout London's history, really. When migrant groups enter the UK, they find their footing predominantly in Newham, and they then move on to other locations across the country. It's got one of the highest youth populations. Yeah, squeeze in. Sorry about that, just my colleague. Yeah, it's got one of the 3/3 of the population is made up of young people under 25, and equally it's one of the most culturally diverse, religiously diverse locations in London and the country. So it's got a lot of assets what need unlocking, but equally it has its own inherent challenges because of the issues I've raised. Newham Council have done tremendously well. They've been trailblazers and a lot of models to engaging residents, from citizen assemblies, participatory budgeting programs, youth assemblies, etc., etc. But they wanted to push themselves. They wanted to stretch themselves, but also learn from other councils what they were doing, but also amplify what they were doing and sharing best practice. So they brought me on board as a kind of critical friend in order to understand their systems, structures and processes as it relates to participatory decision-making and participatory democracy. And also kind of with them develop a participation academy business case, where they're hoping that will be the legacy of this piece of work, really. They can sustain what they're doing and do what they're doing in a much smarter way. Why they couldn't do it? Well, they couldn't do it themselves through institutional barriers. When I dug deep, why participation doesn't flourish as well as it could is that policy officers lack the confidence, and they lack that negotiation skills internally to actually sell what they're doing and to push back against elected members who, of course, have got their own agendas like any department head. So it was a bit about capacity and capability and pressures of delivering the 9-to-5 job. It was that normal dilemma in any institutions where services and functions and individuals, they aren't talking to one another. They're that disconnect. So although they're doing all this fantastic work, like I've described, nowhere in that organisation is it brought together. There was no repository what brings together all their research when they talk to residents, or research what they commission from people like myself. There was nowhere where they could identify when the council officers was engaging with residents in the community to piggyback events or to disseminate information. So there was a lack of that internal dialogue, what the council lacked. So again, I was that independent, objective individual that was able to come in and have those kind of detailed conversations. So what I actually did as a methodology, as an approach to understand what they do, and then start developing the business case was, first of all, it was an evidence review, looking at what is done internationally in terms of best practice, in terms of all the types of work the two earlier speakers have spoken about, looking at what they do and the strengths and weaknesses in what they do. The second was developing a policy lab, which was an interesting activity. So we had a timetable policy lab over a space of a year where we invited policy officers from across the country and internationally to join us for a structured conversation around the key issues. And so we had colleagues all the way from Brussels, all the way to Detroit in the United States. Out of those participants, we identified 5 demonstrator projects who are also kind of, in a live sense, doing pieces of participatory democracy work. And that then formed, you can say, the nucleus for all our ongoing conversations. And
got 2 minutes left, Darren. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Members of the policy group were then able to group themselves around particular areas of interest. So if I was to identify, for example, in Detroit, this was around the automobile industry and re-engineering and doing placemaking in that space, with America having a different kind of third sector and public sector financial arrangement than the UK. So that was really, really rich learning. In Newham itself, they was developing a new residence charter. So how do council officers, what should be the expectation of the delivery of a service when they interface with residents, and vice versa, what should residents expect when they engage with council officers? So there was a big co-production piece, what went into doing that, which again was fed into all our policy lab discussions. So from these real tangible demonstrator projects, everybody was able to learn and apply that learning across their own councils. But more importantly, I think, coming to my end now, it gave people permission to identify their individual challenges, their team challenges, their organizational challenges, in terms of how do we push participatory democracy agendas forward. And in one sense, we found comfort in knowing we experienced similar challenges. With that learning, that then formed the Participation Academy blueprint. And it's this blueprint really which will be the legacy in the next stage where we start to implement it. So that, I believe, is my 2 minutes. So thank you.
Well, you had 15 seconds spare, Darren. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, some really interesting things there again. Darren, I wonder, how will people be able to access all of that learning that you're describing once it is published?
Oh, well, there's going to be numerous ways, really. So, of course, I'm waiting for the Business Academy proposal to be signed off. Once it's signed off, it will be more of an open access publication through Newham Council. There will also be material on the CAPE website, and I can share all these links with you actually. And then thirdly, we're doing a book chapter, what brings all the kind of rich learning and experience together. So it's a book chapter, the CAPE fellowship website hosted at UCL, and also Newham Council website.
Brilliant, thank you. I am going to open up the Q&A now. We've got about just under 20 minutes. But before I do that, to the public, please do ask your questions in the chat. There's a few that have come through now. I would just like to ask all of you, all 3 of you really, your perspectives. If someone is here now and has got excited, and obviously we have also only just scratched at the surface at the richness of what can be achieved when we involve people in decision making and you know, there are obvious challenges. If people are inspired and they want to do more, maybe in their constituency or in their organization, or just want to find out more, where can they go to, I guess, get support or find out more?
We can start. Well, we can share some links in the chat of resources, information, particularly about the homelessness prevention strategy, legislative theater work that we did. But there's also a lot of information about recent UK-wide legislative theatre initiatives, and in the States, on my website. And there's a website called peoplepowered.org, which I highly recommend. I'm a senior fellow with People Powered. They have a lot of resources. They have free mentorship for people interested in doing participatory democracies, particularly government stakeholders, but also civil society advocates. And a new participation playbook coming out that has, it's a digital playbook free on participatory budgeting, citizens assemblies, legislative theater, and participatory policymaking. So I can put some links in the chat for those resources, but those are really great resources for particularly government policymakers looking to implement more participatory democracy.
Thanks, Katie. Do you want to add anything, Isaac?
I suppose, so I'm a Newham resident and have been involved in sort of the local stuff. So what I would say is that from a lived experience perspective, it's really important to create the right conditions where people feel able to come into spaces where, and you know, so for me, the work that we do, which is very creative, is around minimizing those barriers. So I'll also post a few links to some projects that I've been involved in. But I think there are lots of approaches, and the more approaches that we use and the more that we can share knowledge and learning, it's really, really great. I think it's really important to recognize that even within all of these approaches, we're talking about there are immense barriers, and we have to actively try to minimize those barriers. And often that's done with long-term relationship and really thinking about the groups that we're not seeing in these spaces. I think we've come a long way. I think there's a lot to celebrate, and how much more people are feeling able to challenge and be part of kind of the decision making locally. And I would say that it has to start local, and how we feed into that national thing. So there are lots of opportunities. I'm going to share some links as well. But yeah, I just say encourage people, support people. The role of lived experience and the role of creativeness is really important in that.
Thank you. And obviously our goal in involving people are more kind of equitable and accountable and effective policies. But can anyone speak to maybe the lasting impact beyond the policies, like perhaps the impact on the people who are taking part in these co-produced projects, processes, democracy?
Yeah, well, I don't mind just giving my overview of this project and my wider projects as well.
Thanks,
For
Darren.
me, it's all about placemaking. So it's about kind of improving the health and well-being and sense of belonging, particularly in an area like I described, which you have a pretty mobile communities. And so it may be one act of contributing or trying to shape policy and practice, but you're quite right, it has those long-lasting ramifications. It's allowing people that sense of ownership and defining their own community, which is the bedrock, is the foundation really for a healthy, resilient community.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll come in and add a contribution. So I think sometimes we think of kind of this policies as the end result, and actually policies are the really beginning places where we start to create some of these opportunities for communities to do for themselves. I think it's very much not looking to the state or local authority. It's actually how we really support individuals, groups and communities to come together, to continue to come together, to be fully inclusive, and how we can start sharing some of that power. And I think one of the things that local authorities do play a part in is facilitating that space across communities. The knowledge that we can gather from participatory kind of thinking, creative spaces is really important. And I think that we often can be really siloed in their thinking, and we'd be really kind of protective over kind of the knowledge we acquire or hold. But when we start to share that, I think it starts to change the structures in local places where people feel more able to challenge, but feel more able to step into kind of delivering some of the stuff that we would talk about. Really good example of that here locally was around mutual aid and the COVID pandemic. Now, it wasn't kind of systems that developed that. It was like street by street. And what added to that is when systems came in and got offered that bits of support. So how can we think about the place? How can we think about what people can contribute? And recognizing that everybody's contribution will be different, but actually we should value that equally.
Thanks, Isaac. Can see lots of nodding there. Katie and John, do you want to add anything?
I think it's important to say it's a massive mixed bag when it comes to how are people going to be affected by it, and a lot of people get hurt, damaged, and disillusioned by it, because the change that's proffered, which you end up using as the part of the, get something off the ground and get a conversation started. It's not always going to be met with the effects that you want to see, or indeed are actually technically possible, and that you've just played out for people that will be beneficial. And sometimes the experience of that, like kind of, it's quite profound social defeat. And sometimes it's kinder not to look at it than it is to dig into it.
Yeah, and I think that goes, I think the way I think about that is very much kind of what Isaac was just saying too, that we can't only be relying on the state or the policy levers, because they're not going to move fast enough and equitably enough for what we need. And so I think, like, for example, in Greater Manchester, one of the things that's come out of the kind of 2 years of working on the homelessness prevention strategy is this group of the GM Jokers, right? Which is this collective, people with lived experience, who are now facilitating work for councils, for charities, to engage them in co-production on an ongoing basis. Because that's the other thing that I think happens a lot with co-producing policy and participatory democracy, is that it's a very kind of beginning and end, a project with a beginning and end. People get dumped, and then especially if people get dumped without the change they want to see, that's like a double problem. And so there's two things. One is that we cannot just wait for the state to solve all the problems as the end of our process. And two, I think that leadership needs to be embedded, an ongoing kind of participation.
It's that power redistribution, hasn't it? That's got to be the motivation guiding it. Otherwise, like, you've got that weird situation where there's an ambivalence around turning people from research subjects into participants. And like, nah, it gets met with massive resistance because of the structural inequalities that were here, that brought us in the room. The whole class racism thing, like, rich people doing policy didn't come here to get talked about. They didn't get told how to do the job by some unemployed person from Levenshulme. That's the crack.
Thanks for that honesty, and I think it is really important to just be clear about that. And that is also what I love about these processes, where you are just naming and calling it out, and that is a big part of having that safe dialogue. And I guess safe isn't the right word, but secure maybe. Right, I've got one more question here, and then I am definitely, I promise, heading over to the chat, but I am a bit overwhelmed by it because all the messages are just popping. We've had some talk about, well, we've talked about localism and very much about place-based and engaging people with their immediate surroundings and the things that they might be able to change a little bit more easily, because it's, well, I use that carefully. And, some of our international partners, which you've touched on, Darren, are in some places could be seen as having made more headway than we have, particularly in England. There are variations across England, Wales and Scotland as well, even though we are such a small island. What could be the accelerator to get this moving a little bit faster in the UK? Anyone got any thoughts on that?
Go ahead, Darren.
Yeah, well, just very briefly, I'll just mention, with my particular demonstrator projects, it was actually the reverse, to be quite honest with you, in terms of using people, organising, using people power and penetrating the system, or that kind of change barrier, what they was targeting at. So although we're not there yet by any means or stretch of the imagination, I think as a community, as a collective, we're far, far further even if it's just having the understanding of what this process, this community, this conversation is about, as opposed to colleagues in North America. And like I mentioned, it's a different kind of budgetary relationships and a different sense of citizenship as well, in terms of what you think you can influence and where big money plays a role in that. Equally in Brussels and on the continent, it's a different charity sector, a different voluntary sector, and a different role for governments and principalities. So although there's lots of things I think we can learn from overseas, I think ultimately, from my understanding and my work, yeah, we're trailblazers, and I think we can confidently say that in this area.
Thanks, Darren. All right, time is not on our side. So Katy and John, if you want to respond quickly, please.
I was just going to say, there are some projects in sort of the legislative theater realm brewing in national government. And so I think there's definitely an opportunity for that. And there are bodies like Policy Lab UK, which is within national government, that's actually working on what they're calling experimental policy. And I would recommend looking at their experimental methods cards, which includes games, legislative theater, citizens assemblies. They have these cards with beautiful illustrations, and that's available on their website. But one of the things that we've been saying to some of these national agencies that I won't name yet is, like, first of all, they can start thinking about participatory methods internally as a way to get people on board. So how can they make participatory change in their internal policy as a way for people to understand that it's not so scary to involve people in decision making? That's number one. Number two is that, as everyone's been talking about, fun and kind of bringing a civic space where everyone's yelling at each other, sort of a perfect situation for participatory democracy and co-production is when everybody's mad at each other and you have a deadline, right? I mean, you have to deliver something and everybody's mad at each other. So it's now an emergency. So we have to take the risk. So we're sort of, I mean, it's not, we don't, the short timelines don't help anybody, but the sense of like, the sense of urgency and the sense of everything's already crap, so you better do something risky, right? And I try to get them to lean into that. Like, when everybody's mad at you about something, that's a great situation.
And just if you're looking for an accelerant, I'd check out the chaotic dissolution of philanthropic funding right now. That's going to shake up the participation model a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and actually, you know, government can think about that in terms of like taking a real leap towards redistributing resources.
Fucking democracy.
Yeah. And there was one question about in the chat about, yes, definitely check out John Alexander's book Citizens and the New Citizens Project. There was one question in the chat about the cost of these things, and I think that's one of the things that national government also has been surprised to learn, is that sometimes these processes are less expensive than the fancy consultants that they're bringing in from Deloitte, right? So you can put £20,000, maybe £50,000 and do a really big policy co-production project. That's not a ton of money in the scope of the work they're working on to come up with a strategy, right? That's actually pretty affordable. So, and they're surprised to learn that cost is not one of the biggest barriers. Maybe a citizens assembly is £80,000, £100,000, going to involve a lot of people. You're going to get real specific outputs. So the costs are, I think they're actually going to save money from the kind of, you know, deep, big, fancy reports they get commissioned that nobody reads.
Yeah, which again brings like the cross-pollination between commissioners and consultant managers. Yeah. Well, that's just a long-standing thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's it from us.
Thank you. I'm going to try and squeeze in a couple of more questions, unless Isaac, you've got a desperate point to add to that.
Yeah, so my really important point would be the rub, and the rub is actually more people with lived experience leading these spaces. So it's not just about inviting people in, it's lived experience, people, local people having that power, making sure that accountability comes back to the people that are living and breathing what we're trying to solve. So more lived experience, more councils, more kind of processes around democracy involving the very people you know they're trying to serve.
Thanks. I've got a question here saying that these processes sound very metropolitan and youthful and very interesting, but actually there's an aging population, rural, seaside settlements, kind of people who are maybe communities that are quite physically isolated. Any lessons for those kind of areas?
Go to people. People don't need to come to you. It's about meeting people where they're at, and there's never going to be one approach that works for one particular place. There were people, you know, you have to be really proactive and connect to where people are at.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also just add, lean into the services what work with these groups or locations. For example, we engage Aged UK, and they shared how they do their outreach work with the aging population. And so it's then how do you fuse their approach and bring it into the policy domain? So you adopt, you identify, adopt, and adapt.
Thank you. I've got a question here specifically about community reporting. We will send out some information. Isaac, will you send me a slide and I'll send it out?
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you. Should people be paid to participate? Absolutely. And there are lots of guides around engagement and involvement, and the Structural Inequality Alliance is actually producing an ethical framework of participation. So you could look out for that resource, although we've only just started to think about that. So it'll be a while, but yes, absolutely pay. There are lots more questions here, and I'm so sorry we are definitely run out of time. It is 1:30. I will propose that I will leave the chat room open, and that if you want to have some conversations, you know, maybe you could still do that in this space. Unfortunately, I am taking the speakers away with me, because they all have other events to get to this afternoon. But if you want to speak between yourselves as citizens full of ideas and further questions, I promise I will go through the questions, and any that we can answer, I will send via an email with the links, the clip, the audio clip, which couldn't play, and any other things. I just want to say a huge thank you for giving up your time and joining us today. And a massive thank you to all of our speakers. You've shared absolutely brilliant, honest, exciting, thought-provoking perspectives. So a big round of applause for you. And this was our very first SIA event. So you've all made history. Well done. Pat on a little round of applause for each and every one of you who has shown interest and wanted to be a part of the conversation. And on that note, we're a minute over. I'm sorry, because your time is valuable, and I am going to end there. So thank you very much. But like I say, if you want to turn your camera on and have a chat, Joe and Priya from the Equality Trust are going to stick around. But Katy, Isaac, Darren, we're off.